This is an interview of Mr. Edward Jackal, born November 6th, 1917. The interview is conducted by Robert Gardner. Mr. Jackal, what branch of service were you in?
I was in the infantry with the Army and served with the 90th Division with the 3rd Army, General Patton's Army.
What was your rank and where did you serve, sir?
My final rank was Staff Sergeant, and I served after my training in the United States, in England, for about 2.5 weeks. And then I fought through Normandy in actual combat, through most of France, and then the Saarland, where I got my final wound, and then later I trained men to become infantrymen in England after I recovered from my wounds. And after the war was over, they sent me to Frankfurt with the Army of Occupation, and I was there about 6 or 7 months before being sent home, because I had acquired a lot of points on the discharge system, and I was surprised that I hadn't served quite 2 years, so that I got home gratefully.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted while I was living in the city of Rochester, New York. But since my draft board was in New York City, I returned to New York, and from there, New York City, and from there I went into the service.
Do you recall your first days in the service?
I recall them very clearly. I think the most interesting thing was that I told the man who was interviewing me for the branch of the Army that I would go into, and I told him that I was a physical education worker and an athletic director, and he said, "Great, you go into the infantry because you guys know how to fight." And so into the infantry I went.
Can you tell me about your boot camp or training experiences?
Yes, I'd be glad to, because I said to myself, hurrah, I'm going to Florida. And we were on a train, and crowded train, for about 2 or 3 days, shunted to the sidings for special stuff, and it took us 2 or 3 days to go from Camp Dix to Camp Blanding, Florida. Camp Blanding was located in the middle of Florida, not too far from the small city of Stark, and equidistant from Tallahassee, St. Augustine, and Daytona Beach. I took 16 weeks of training at Camp Blanding. I think that they gave us wonderful training. I don't think that I would have survived without the 16 weeks of training that we received. I remember the name of the captain of my company. His name was Hinson, H-I-N-S-O-N. And he was a fair and square man. Now, that was not true of the cadre. The cadre tried to browbeat us. They took advantage of the fact that we had no rank and bullied us in many instances, but in some ways we got even.
How did you get through your basic training?
How did I get to basic?
How did you get through your basic training?
Oh, I got through basic training. They even considered me for an officer's candidate school. But I know some of the cadre didn't like the way at times I stood up to them, and so while I wasn't really insubordinate, I was part of a group of men in my cabin who evaded them when they hunted for us for extra duty and dirty details, so that they made sure that I didn't go to OCS, although you'll read later in my citation for the Silver Star Medal for adroit leadership or something like that. So But that's the way it went. But the training was excellent. We were in the swamps and the bad grounds and snakes and a lot of marching. And one other thing, it was one of the coldest winters that Florida ever had. That was the winter of 1944. We were there January, February, March, and it didn't warm up until April. Men got pneumonia in the big auditoriums where they were giving lectures. Men were coughing and going to the hospital. We were in a 6-man shack that was porous, and the cold air of that winter just poured through. So the Army relented and put a stove in there, because normally they don't, and instead of wearing khakis, we wore our ODs, our dark ODs. And they also, after a while, issued every man a comforter, believe it or not, sort of a quilted blanket. We were very cold. The camp and the surrounding area was loaded with all kinds of snakes. And we'd go out, sometimes we'd be riding to an area for training. We'd see dozens of snakes killed all along the way. And the deadliest one was the coral snake. And it was reported that several men were bitten by that snake and died within an hour.
Which war did you serve in?
Pardon me?
Which war did you serve in, sir?
I served in World War II.
Where exactly did you go?
First, I went to Camp Dix again, and then I went to England, and when we landed in England, they lined us up, and then they called out a lot of names, and my name was among them. So I parted from my buddy Johnny Hull. Johnny Hull. Johnny and I got acquainted at Camp Dix and by a crap game, and he was later became my foxhole buddy by sheer coincidence, which I will relate later. And he went on to become an infantryman, and I stayed in England to take in the radio school, because somehow they thought I had the ability to learn the dots and dashes and the Morse code and all that. We were in the training for the radio school, and I was in there about 5 weeks. I had already sent home for a letter to get money so I could buy a bicycle so I could ride into town. And then some ship went down in New York Harbor, sunk by a submarine, rumors said, or just disabled in some way, and they didn't have enough replacements to go help with the Army and the fighting in Normandy. And so they broke up the radio school. Some of the men had 2 and 3 days to go. I had about 2 or 3 weeks to go. And they just took it apart, and everybody was shifted into the infantry. And I went across the English Channel in a boat, and a great many of the men got sick. I felt kind of queasy at times. And then we landed at Omaha Beach, and I went past the fortification and wondered how we ever got up those hills, how we ever got through there with the troops. And then we got on a truck, and the first night they told us to dig in. But because I had been in radio school, I was softened up, and I couldn't dig deep with my foxhole. My hands were hurting, my arms were hurting. I must have had a hole maybe 1 foot deep. It could just barely cover my body. And they had a bomber come over that they called Bed Check Charlie. And he deposited some bombs that must have landed a quarter of a mile or a half a mile away. It shook up the ground, and it scared the heck out of me. That was my first day of combat, and I wondered how I could actually take real fire at myself by guns and other things. And then the next day, we traveled on by truck to another replacement depot, and then I finally came to the 90th Division, to which I had been assigned. I'd like to relate one interesting thing that happened to me at Camp Dix. I was married, I had a wife and a child, and I wanted to see them, and so I got someone to sell me a pass. But the question was, how do you get out to make sure that they don't look at the pass too thoroughly, because it was not a good forging job. And so I knew that every fence had a hole in it. So I walked around, and sure enough, there was a hole in the fence. And I told my buddy Johnny that I'm going through, and here's the number of where I can be reached in case they start looking for me, and I can come back as soon as I can. And during the time I was there, I went out 4 different times through the hole, and soldiers in that day, or servicemen in that day, easily got a ride. And I got a ride from Princeton, New Jersey, where Camp Dix was, into New York, and saw my wife and my son. And then finally, they told us, stay in your bunks and in your barracks, because tomorrow you're shipping out. And if you're caught out, you're going to get sent to prison, and some of you might even face the firing squad for desertion of in the face of the enemy. And I realized that they were not telling the truth, but at the same time, I was very cautious. But I was determined to see my wife. And I went there and I saw her, and I came back early in the morning, about 5 o'clock, on the train. That's the way I came back, on the train, to make sure I got there. And so I'm sitting on the train, and there are other servicemen in the train, and about 2 stations before we get to Dix, MPs come on the train. And they look around, and one of them, a sergeant, comes over to me and he says, where's your pass? I said, here, and I showed him my pass. And he says, this is not worth the paper to wipe my butt with. And I said, well, that's the one I've got. He says, but forget it. You're shipping out tomorrow, and I know it. You're a lucky guy. And he walked away. But I wondered, why had he picked on me? Because there were a whole bunch of servicemen in the thing, and the only one he walked to was me. So I walked up to him just before the train got to Camp Dix, and I said, Sergeant, why did you pick at me? He said, if you want to live in the front lines where you're going, you have to be more alert. I said, what do you mean? He said, look around you. I did. He said, what do you see? I said, I don't see anything different with them and me. And he said, look at your braid on your cap. It's a blue infantry braid. Everybody in the car is either yellow, green, or other colors. You're the only infantryman in the car. You should have taken your cap off. I smiled, and my face turned white, I think, and I thanked him, and I got off the train, and he said, I knew you were going over tomorrow anyhow, and you're coming back. You're not trying to get away, so you're a lucky guy. And anyway, to get back to where I was, the truck deposited me with the 90th Infantry Division. That's called the Texas-Oklahoma Division. It's a T and an O on a green patch. The T and the O are red. And they had landed on D-Day, and most of the men there were veterans. And to my surprise, who greets me but Johnny Hull from New Jersey. And he persuades Sergeant Burton, that was his real name, to take me into the squad. And so Johnny and I wound up sharing a foxhole from the time I joined the division till Thanksgiving Day 1944. And we were inseparable. At times we were insubordinate. We were the typical wise Easterner, and Sergeant Burton retaliated by giving us the dirty details, carrying the water jugs, the big 2-gallon or something like that jugs. We went for ammunition. We had to go on special patrols. If he didn't like where we dug our foxhole, he made us dig it in another place. And we retaliated by snickering and giving him baleful looks, which he ignored. And one day, he had had enough of this. And he took us to the captain. First, he said, as he approached our foxhole, "The captain wants to see you." The captain had a foxhole that somebody had dug in a remote area away from the general or rest of the company. The captain had his carbine in his hand. And he says, "Sergeant Burton, beat it." And he said to us, "You men have been insubordinate." And we both said, "No, sir." And we never had been directly insubordinate, but we had dallied when we should have hustled and things like that. And he said, "I don't stand for insubordination in my company." And then he raised the carbine to his shoulder, put his finger on the trigger, and we thought we could see that the safety was off. Well, to this day, I'm not sure. And he said, "I could shoot you and get away with it, and no one would say a word because you've been insubordinate in time of war. If I have any more trouble with you two men, you will regret it." And he never did have trouble with the both of us. We were really good soldiers, and we became canny fighters. We became men that you would be glad to follow or associate with. Anyway, most of the men in our platoon and the company were Southerners. We were the few Yankees. Some of the boys bragged about how the first pair of new shoes they ever owned were given to them by the Army. And we could believe it. We helped the men read their letters. They said they couldn't read handwriting. They could only read printed letters. And then we also wrote letters for them, I especially, and they thanked us. Since I had a certain command of the French language and also a little German, I managed to secure wine for them by the swapping process. And to many extents, they were grateful. But there was still the feeling, "You're a damn Yankee." And we got along, and several times Johnny and I saved the company. We doing all right?
Yep.
Several times Johnny and I saved the company. One time, for example, we were with a lieutenant who was new. The lieutenants were frequently replaced because they were either wounded or shot or killed. And they really led well, and they were brave men. But not all of them had the smarts that we had acquired in several months of combat. I was in combat a total of 140 days from the time I got with the 90th until I received my last wound. I must have had 4 or 5 different lieutenants. And so this man was leading us to a small town, and he was supposed to come in the front way of the town and check it out to make sure that there were no Germans in the town with surprises. And as we went along through these woods, he was consulting his compass frequently. And I told Johnny, "I don't think he knows where he's going." And Johnny says, "I agree, it looks like he's lost." And finally we arrived at what we presumed was the town. We had to reconnoiter. And suddenly Johnny and I think it was me, we saw a box, yellow crates, empty, and the word Minen, M-I-N-E-N, was on the boxes. I said, Johnny, the mines have to be somewhere. We came through the back of the town, and where the lieutenant got us lost. We didn't come through the front of the town, so evidently the mines must be in the front of the town. It was that simple. We go to the lieutenant and we tell him what we think, and he's there with Sergeant Gross, our platoon sergeant, and he doesn't want to listen. I said, Sergeant, Lieutenant, if you don't listen, a lot of men are going to get killed. And Sergeant Gross says, listen to these guys. They're smart New York cookies, something like that. And the lieutenant says, I can't break radio silence. And the sergeant said, if you don't break radio silence, you're going to be responsible for a lot of deaths and wounded men. He finally broke radio silence and told the captain to circle around the town. And sure enough, the captain was about to approach the front of the town, and he circled around and joined us. And then later, the engineers confirmed that the front of the town or small city was thoroughly mined, and we saved our company from being devastated by the mines. And there were other instances where our abilities as infantrymen, as it developed, did good things for the company. We were inseparable. We shared foxholes, and we shared food. We shared cognac. One time we captured a big warehouse full of cognac, and Johnny and I told him it's great booze, and neither one of us were big drinkers, but the cognac was so tasty, and we were thirsty and tired, and neither one of us were big drinkers, but they had us in a barn that day in this town, and we were drinking, and I drank about a third of a bottle, and Johnny drank about the same amount, and then we lay down and we fell into a drunken sleep or torpor, or whatever you want to call it. And when we woke up, both of our bottles were empty. I said, Johnny, you've been drinking too much. He says, oh no. And then someone told us that some other guys came over and swapped their empty bottles for our full bottles. Among the information I have is shows pictures of me in combat in a photo studio. I'm wearing my combat hat. I got a small combat pack on my back. I have a rifle with bayonet, and I'm wearing leggings, the old-fashioned leggings, and there are flowers in the background. So it's odd that here's a man in combat regalia, and there are flowers in the back when the man took the picture. What happened is we were going through a small town, and all of a sudden Jerry started pouring in a lot of artillery 88s on us. Everybody ran for shelter, and you get separated from your buddies and everybody else, but you want to live, so you run to where you think the strongest house is. I went to the strongest house, the door was open, I ran in and thumped around looking for a place to hide in the house, and all of a sudden a trap door opened from the floor, and a man with a mustache, typical French mustache, beckoned me with a finger. And so I followed him down a rickety ladder to a basement, and in the basement was his wife, 2 children, and his mother-in-law. And we talked, and I shared my K rations with him. I had my combat pack with me. I had some candy, which I gave the children. Oh, I gave him most of a pack of cigarettes, although I didn't smoke much because I was a jock most of my life, and I didn't inhale, but I had to smoke because otherwise the guys would say, hey, he doesn't smoke. What is he? What kind of guy is he? So I used to light up cigarettes, but I never inhaled, and I carried them. And most of the time I'd give my cigarettes to my buddy Johnny. But I gave the cigarettes to the man, and he said, you are John T., and you are very nice, and in appreciation I'd like to take your picture. I said, what good is your taking my picture if I won't get a copy of it? He said, I could mail it to you. I said, how would you know where I would be? And then I suddenly remembered that GIs would be coming through the town, probably following us, the guys from the service commands and so on. And I said, here is my address. And so private first class at the time, Edward Jackal, 42570916, and it was APO 90 ETO. And the envelopes were franked. You know, we had free franking privilege. I said, you can take this in my broken French. And sometimes I wrote words down on a pad so he could understand it better. And you give it to any serviceman, and he will be glad to mail it to me at this address. He said, certainement, and things like that. He kissed me on both cheeks. The old lady kissed me on both cheeks. And I wound my way up the rickety stairs because the shelling had stopped, and I had to get back to my company and see how Johnny was making out. And finally I come up to Johnny, and Johnny said, where you been? I said, Johnny, you won't believe it, but I was getting my picture taken. He says, you're always telling stories. I said, Johnny, it's true. One of these days I'll get the pictures, the guy is going to mail it to me, and you'll be surprised. But I never showed those pictures. I finally received the pictures in about January of 1945 when I was in a hospital bed in England, a town called Warminster, but I couldn't show them to Johnny. So I mailed the pictures home to my mother and my father, and they are here on some of the articles. This is not the picture. This picture was taken in England. But there was another picture without the regalia, which showed my face with just an army shirt and no cap or anything else. And I still have the pictures. And after the war, I did see Johnny in New Jersey. I visited him, and I showed him the pictures. But more about that later.
Could you hold that picture up for a moment?
Sure.
So I can zoom in here on it? Oh,
Okay?
that's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Could you tell me about any other combat experiences or any medals or awards that you were
Well, I can tell you briefly as I can. Well, I have other pictures, by the way, here, all kinds of pictures. I can tell you stories, humor. You're interested in humor stories as well as combat stories? Because this took place in a combat area.
That's fine too, sir.
Okay, we were always hungry in our drive through Normandy. When you're in combat, tension makes you hungry, but in addition to being hungry, you desire sweets. And we were always hungry for sweets. Now we had K rations at that time, and they were good, and we'd eat them with a spoon, which we kept in our pocket. We never carried knives or forks. When we went into a rest area, maybe once every 2.5 weeks, then our truck would come back, our company truck would come back up, and we'd eat hot meals. And then they'd give us mess kits and knives and forks and so on. But mostly we ate with a spoon. K rations, C rations, B ration. And the thing we talked about all the time was not food, but candy. We wanted the Hershey bars, Milky Way, Snickers, Love Nest, Baby Roots, you name it. And we never got any of them. When I was in Blanding, they told us that the good candies were overseas, but I never saw them. We had the cheap candies and some of those British candies that had no sugar whatsoever. So all we talked about was sweets, and I would tell them that instead of a candy bar, I would like to have just one of my mama's rugelach, and they could have 3 candy bars, and I wouldn't swap. And they asked me, how is it made? And I told them, the rugelach were a Jewish type of cookie, which was made with cookie dough And inside of it, and I won't go through the whole process, is cinnamon, brown sugar, and raisins, and all kinds of chopped up nuts. And when you bite into one, it's crunchy like a normal cookie, but also you have the inside ingredients which add to the flavor, and you really go wild about it. And my mother was a noted baker, and so on. Now, the true story of it is that I never asked my mother to send me cookies. But one day my sister wrote me a letter and said that Mama baked up a big batch of cookies, and they're on the way. And that the mailman said that the box would come there about 10 days after you received my airmail letter. In my story, which I wrote up, part of my book, I am compelled to write to my mother to ask for cookies. But that was not the fact. I wasn't the type of boy or man to ask my mother to send me something like that. Anyway, when the men found out that the cookies were coming, their mouths were watering. They were salivating. And of course, I was thinking of them, and Johnny was in ecstasy. He couldn't wait. As a matter of fact, one night he woke me up and said, and we were in a foxhole, and he poked me. He said, "You're talking about your mother's cookies again." I said, "Johnny, I can't help it. I keep dreaming about the cookies because they're going to get here any day, and oh, you've got some good eating ahead of you." And he said, "Shh," and we heard other shh from the other foxholes around us. "You guys got to keep quiet. You're in a combat zone." And then the next day morning, they asked me, while we're having our K-ration eggs, they asked us, "What were you guys talking about last night? Don't you know there's a goddamn war going on?" And Johnny says he was dreaming about his mama's cookies again. I said, "Listen, those cookies are coming," and everybody was high, anticipating them. Every mail, we all gathered around, but no boxes came. And 2 weeks went by, no cookies. Men who went into the hospital for medical reasons or because of wounds would come back and say, "Did those cookies come here yet?" And everybody said, "Oh, they're never going to get here." Well, one day, when we had just about given up hope, a big box, battered and a little torn, was delivered along with the other mail. And it had my name on it. But the box was dented, torn in places. It looked like it had been kicked around, and men had been throwing it from truck to boats, boats to trucks, and throwing it around. But I was glad to see it because I knew my mama's cookies were there. And the men gathered around. I borrowed Sergeant Mullins' knife, cut the cord, lifted up the lids of the corrugated box, and shoved aside the wrapping paper, and I put my hand in, and I was so disappointed because all it was, it looked like sand with some pebbles. And I said, "Fellas, the rugelach, the cookies, were all banged up. They're not worth anything." And all of us had a look of dismay on our faces. And then Sergeant Mullins took his spoon out, dug it into the box, picked it up, put it into his mouth, and crunched, and his face beamed. And he quickly put his spoon back in there. But we weren't slow either. We put our spoons back in there. Honestly, in about 10 minutes, that big box was empty of every speck of cookies. And it was delicious. And everybody was wiping his mouth and said, "Your mother sure can bake." Well, I wrote my mother a letter. And I said, "Mom, I want you to know the cookies finally arrived. And I'm glad to tell you we enjoyed them thoroughly. As a matter of fact, we ate them down to the very last crumb." And that's the end of that story.
Can you tell me about any medals or citations that you got while you were
Yeah,
in
well,
service?
I got the, I told you about the pictures. I'd like to tell you one other story. Is that up permissible? This is another story that I've sold a number of times. It's called the Moselle chicken. One day as we were going through Normandy, Johnny told me, and this is a true story, and so is the Rugelach story, a story absolutely true. We're going through Normandy and, you know, marching on files either side of the road, rifles on our shoulders, slung over our shoulder. And Johnny says, "See that cow there? I bet it would make good eating." And I said, "Johnny, it sure would make good eating, but how could we cook them? We don't have any stoves." Well, he says, "Well, we just shoot them and cut them up." And I said, "Johnny, that's impossible." But a little later on, we took a break, and it was right near a farm. And in the courtyard, we could see some chickens. And Johnny says, "Let's go get us some chickens." I says, "Well, we can get some eggs," but he says, "Let's get some chickens. I'm tired of eating eggs. We get eggs anyhow in our K rations, and we fried some on tin cans, haven't we?" I said, "We sure have." He says, "What I'd like to do is eat some chicken." I said, "Well, how do we do that?" He said, "Look, we get the chickens, we take them into a town, and on our next break, we can get maybe somebody to cook them for us. We'll pay them money, and we'll give them cigarettes and candy and all the, oh, and coffee. We had those thin packets of coffee, George Washington coffee, in aluminum foil." And I said, "Okay." So we got a break, and we went into the courtyard, and we tried to catch the chickens. And we couldn't catch them. They were too fast for two clumsy men. We had put our rifles aside, but we still had our helmets on, and we had leggings and brogans, and we weren't used to running, and they were agile, and we couldn't catch them. Then we heard Sergeant Mullins saying, "That ain't no way to catch them chickens, you stupid city boys." I said, "Well, you show us." He got a big stick and knocked them off their feet, and then we grabbed them while they were on the ground, and each of us carried one chicken as we got back into formation to march to the nearest town. As luck would have it, we walked down the road, and each of us had a chicken under the other arm, and on one arm was a rifle, and the chickens would squawk and make all kinds of funny sounds that we weren't used to. And everybody was laughing and wondering, but we didn't care because those chickens were going to be our dinner. We were determined to get some chicken. And consequently, we come to a town, and the captain says, "We're going to have a 3-hour break." And the word was passed down, 3-hour break. And so the civilians came out to look at us. And we got together some cigarettes, some K-ration cans, and the instant coffee packets. And we tried to make the people understand, Johnny and I, that we'd give them all these goodies if they would bake, roast, or cook, or however they could, the chickens. But nobody seemed to want to take our offer because we were sort of dirty, and some of us hadn't washed for maybe a week or 2 weeks. And I don't think we looked anything but desperados. And so, out of the corner of my eye, with my good peripheral vision, I saw an old lady looking at us. She had an apron on, and she was looking at us. So we walked over to her with our chickens, and I explained to her. And then to make it good, I took out some of our French Army money. The Army had given us money every payday, so we would buy things instead of taking them. And so we had what we call American francs, and we piled about maybe $10 worth on top of the pile of things we were about to give. And she nodded her head. She took that and all those things and put them in our apron. And then she grabbed one bird and grabbed it by the head and snapped it and killed it instantly with one snap. She did the same thing with the other one. Oh, and I told her, by pointing to my watch, I said, "We've only got 2 hours." I didn't want to say 3 hours. I said 2 hours. And I said it in French, and I showed her the number on it. She said, "Oui, oui, oui." And she hurried away to a house that was about a block away. And we could see her going into the house with the chickens. But they weren't cackling anymore. And then we said, "Oh, we're going to get a good meal. And we were going to share it with you guys in the squads," we told the fellows in our squad. We were both privates, but the Army, for once, didn't stay longer. They cut the break. And before the 2 hours were up, we were on our way. And we said, I guess it wasn't meant to be for us to get any chickens. And we're marching toward the sound of artillery fire. On either side of the road, Army men, GIs. And suddenly, we hear whistling back in the direction we've come from. Guys were whistling, guys were laughing, and there comes this old lady on a bicycle, and the smell and the aroma of the chickens was wafted to us through the air. And in the basket as she's riding, wrapped in newspapers, we could see as she approached, we could see and smell the chickens. And she was looking down the line of soldiers, and she found us. And she gave us the chickens. And we wanted to give her more money because she had delivered them. She wouldn't take it. And we told her merci, and we grabbed the chickens, and we started tearing them apart, and we passed it up and down the line, and we ate the chickens, and they were delicious. To this day, it's been the most tastiest chicken I've ever eaten in my life. And that's an absolutely true story. And that's the Moselle chicken. I'll give you a copy. You can keep it if you want to. And now, you asked about combat. We fought through the Maginot Lines. We fought through the Siegfried Line, the German Siegfried Line. We helped capture the undefeated fortress of Metz. And right after we captured the fortress of Metz, it was sometime in, I don't know, around the middle of November. And around the middle of November, and they finally stopped our march, and we came into a town, and to our surprise, they gave us showers, and we took showers, and they gave us clean uniforms, and overcoats, heavy army overcoats, and also combat boots, and we could get haircuts. Why? Because General Patton wanted to parade us through the town of Metz to show that we had captured the town, which we had. But actually, we hadn't fought in the town. We had fought around the areas of the town. Anyway, my company hadn't fought in the town of Metz. And that thing had never been captured before in the history of Europe. And so we get to the town and we start parading through with our new overcoats on, our new combat boots. We were glad to get rid of those leggings. And I want you to know that we felt great. We looked different. You couldn't recognize some of the guys because really shaving was an ordeal, and getting a haircut, forget it. And sometimes we wouldn't get a bath in maybe 3-4 weeks. Occasionally we'd wash in a nearby river or creek or something like that. But so this is November, and all of a sudden, while we're parading in nice formation, the whole division is on parade, we hear the sound of the 88s. They had a whistling noise. And everybody hit the dirt on either side of the road, and we were covered with mud. And we looked awful. And then finally, we heard that tank destroyers had come by and got the tank that had shelled us, and we continued to parade. But we didn't look half as good as we did when we started. And I had one of the most memorable things that I ever saw in the war was one day we were going across the Siegfried Line, and they had tunnels, or not tunnels, sort of walkways, where they walk from one pillbox to another pillbox. And we were going across, and we knock out, we're about to knock out a pillbox, and all of a sudden they open up on us. And so we all ran in different directions. So I'm running in one direction, and I come up, and I'm on the back side of a pillbox. So I go across the pillbox, and I must have made some noise, but on the front of it, a door opens, and there am I on top of the pillbox, and 3 Germans come out. But as I said, I had been crawling on the ground, and I had 2 grenades attached to my straps for my pack. And I tried to pull the ring out of the grenade so I could chuck it down there, but my hands were muddy, and the ring was cinched in so it shouldn't open by error, and I couldn't open it. So the only thing I could do was take a chance and pop them with my M1. And their backs were turned to me. But I knew that if they had a chance to do it to me, they would do it to me. And so I fired at them, I emptied my whole clip, and all 3 men went down. And one man's helmet flew off, and he had blonde hair and blue eyes. And to this day, I still remember the first man I saw that I killed. Previously, I would, you kill a man from 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards, and you wouldn't even know if you killed him or wounded him, because other guys were shooting at him at one time, which is the story of the bravest thing I ever saw. One of the bravest things I ever saw, I saw a lot of brave things, was we had a guy called George Warshauer. He came from Milwaukee. And he was a big burly guy. He was about 31 or 32, a big gut on him. And when I joined the company, they were still talking about his speed of foot. I said, what do you mean? He can't run well. He says, he sure can when someone's shooting at him. He says, the other day, we were behind some hedgerows. By the way, that was nasty fighting. We were behind some hedgerows, and we saw a tank approaching. And right from behind the hedgerows, George loaded his bazooka, and his bazooka man assistant stood behind him and attached it. And then George aimed at the tank, and I swear it wasn't more than 15 yards away, I was told. And his bazooka shell went under the tank. And when the tank heard that, it opened up on all of us, and boy, everybody ran. And George dropped his bazooka and his ammunition, and believe it or not, he was the first one back to a safe area. But that's the end of it.
You still got, you got about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And he was the first one back, and therefore everyone constantly commented about his fleetness of foot. But George always kept saying, one of these days I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you that I'm good and that I really can shoot the thing. Well, we went into a town called Diestorf. By the way, this is written up in some books. And General Patton commended my battalion for this thing. We cleaned out about a dozen men who were just a delaying group, and took a couple of prisoners, and then we got ourselves into some nice houses to take a break and to spend the night, and we were told to do it. And the whole company spread out around this town of Diestorf in various houses. And we knew that the Germans would counterattack. And I think the counterattack was by the 11th Panzer Brigade, but I don't remember the exact number. And sure enough, the next morning, they counterattacked. And it was a big open field, and they came across it. They were brave. And we just mowed them down from the buildings, windows that were in small buildings, 1- and 2-story buildings. We had the height advantage, and they came across the open field just as day was breaking, and it was really murder. You never knew whether you killed a man, but you'd see his body shake from the bullets and things like that, because they were all crawling along the ground anyhow. And I don't know if I killed anybody, but I remember my ears were, I couldn't hear well for a while, and 1 or 2 of the men lost their hearing for a couple of days because of all the firing we did. And some rifles got so hot that the front sights dropped off. And you see these movies where the guys fire a lot of rounds and then they hold the rifle by the barrel. You can't do that. The rifle gets hot. But anyway, the Germans got wise and they sent some tanks. They sent some tanks around, and one came from one side of the village, one came from the other. And as they approached the house where they knew we were in, the 88, you could hear it rattle, and the tank treads, and they blast the house. And we knew that we were going to be blasted in a few minutes. And everybody ran to the side of the house away from the street that the tanks were coming down, except George and another man. And we could hear the treads of everything, and we could hear the muzzle, the whole rifle being maneuvered. It was creaking. And we expected a blast at any minute, and then we heard a blast, a real loud blast. And we thought, we've got it, the house is going to topple down. But all we heard was George's voice say, "I got the son of a bitch, I told you I'd get a tank." And out from the tank jumped 3 Germans. And we didn't kill them, we just captured them because they were wounded. And in the tank, I got, from the tank, I got a pair of field glasses and a P-38 Walter and some Nazi banners, which I sent home. But that was the bravest thing I've ever seen, one of the bravest things I've ever seen, how George stood there in the face of that tank and he aimed his bazooka and he saved our hides. Down at the other end of the town, somebody must have seen that this tank was disabled, and they disabled the other one with a bazooka too. And they gave up and we kept the town. Another brave thing I saw once, an American tank was firing at a bunch of us, and I remember this guy's name. His name was Walker, Sergeant Walker. And everybody ducked in the ditches. It was in the hedgerow fighting. But he stood up there. He stood up there and he yelled, "I'm American, I'm American." And he took his helmet off and waved it, and he stopped the tanks from firing it. As it is, that friendly fire hit a few guys. Now, one other thing. Never in World War II did anyone ever talk about what happened to GIs in friendly fire. On Thanksgiving Day of 1944, we, the 90th Infantry Division, had to charge across an open field, and it was cold. I think it was the an early Thanksgiving. I think Franklin Roosevelt made it an early Thanksgiving that year. And we went across an open field. Then we had to walk through a pond with water almost up to our necks, carrying our rifles above our hand. And then we went across this open field, and all of a sudden all hell broke loose. People were shooting at us with rifles and machine guns. And then someone says, "They're killing us." And there were guys falling all over, and men started to run. I want you to know that Johnny and I didn't run. Somehow we kept advancing, and all of a sudden Johnny disappeared, and suddenly I ran, but I carried my rifle with me. I went back through that pond and or that stream, and I never saw Johnny again until after the war. But it was the 30th Infantry Division's first day on the line, and it was sort of a cloudy, slightly foggy day, and they shot us up by mistake. And I've never seen it in any account of World War II, including my division's book written by an officer. And that was another experience. After the war, I was in a hospital in England for a while, and then I was a staff sergeant, by the way, became a staff sergeant. And how I got my medal was simply, we were in Saarland, in a town called Dillingen. And we went across some, we knocked out a lot of pillboxes with bazookas and rifle grenades. And then we came to a big railroad marshalling yard, maybe 8 or 10 or 15 tracks. Must have been all kinds of tracks. And the town of Dillingen was on the other side of the tracks. Or anyway, it seems more buildings were on the other side of the tracks. And the lieutenant said, "I'm going to make we went about 100 yards from the railroad track. He said, 'This is going to be my CP sergeant's you, Sergeant Gross, you and Sergeant Jackal, reconnoiter the town in diligence, see what the strength of the enemy is. He said. And so we went across and went looking through the houses. And all of a sudden, we found in one house a German soldier hiding. Another house, we found another German soldier. He was on the crapper. And altogether, we picked up 3 Germans. And then we heard sound of marching feet and tanks. And all of a sudden, we knew it was Germans because they were not coming from our direction, where the railroad tracks, but coming from the other direction toward the railroad tracks. So we hid in the buildings. And then we played hide and seek with those German tanks and the German infantry. And I told the men, whatever you do, don't fire. I told my squad, don't fire. But somehow, one of the guys thought that he saw somebody looking up at one of the windows of the house we were hiding in, and he fired, and he killed 2 guys and wounded 1, and this guy crawled in a ditch. And he tried to shoot that guy, and I tried to shoot the guy, and we couldn't do it. He was safely in the ditch, and we were about to go out of the house and take care of him, when all of a sudden we hear the tanks. The tanks came, and they didn't talk to the guy, but they put him on the top of the tank. They picked him up and put him on the tank, and then they went away. And we knew that our duration in the house was short. And sure enough, they came back with a lot of infantry, and we heard them coming, and we hid in other houses other than the one we had been hiding in before. And we played hide and seek with them, and took the German prisoners with us, and I told the men we're going to get out. But most of them wanted to surrender. They said, we've done enough, we fought enough. And this was December 9th or 10th of 1944. But I said, no, I'm not going to surrender. And I took over. Sergeant Gross let me take over. And I said, when dusk falls, we're going to use the prisoners to get us through, and I can speak a little German, more like a Yiddish German, and we're going to get them to get us by their front lines. They know the password, and we're going to escape. And some of the guys demurred, but I told them, no, we're not going to be captured. And meanwhile, these prisoners are going to give us valuable information. And I was adamant. And so we started them at dusk. But somehow, we passed through the German lines, and after we passed through the German lines, somehow we were silhouetted against the sunset. And they could then make out better the shape of our uniforms, our helmets, and also somebody had told the German prisoners, not me, to put their hands on their heads, which was the way you usually escort prisoners. And all of a sudden they opened up. And some of my men, we were on the railroad tracks then, some of my men lay down on the tracks. And I realized that sooner or later they would zero in on the tracks. They were firing light artillery pieces and machine guns. And so I went over and I actually picked some of them up and said, you got to keep moving, you got to keep moving. And all of a sudden I got whopped in the leg by several pieces of shrapnel. And my combat boots started to fill up with blood. And the guys that I helped pick up, put my arm around their shoulders, and they helped me get to our lines. And they kept shooting on us, and then we heard voices saying, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And there were other guys in the lines from other companies encouraging us. And that's how we got away. And that's for what I got the Silver Star Medal.
Really appreciate you sharing this with us. Wish we had more time, but this is the limit that they'll allow us.
What about the pictures?
We can do those real quick.
This is a post-war picture.
Okay, all right.
You got it?
Got that one? Yes, sir.
Okay. And this is a post-war picture too.
Okay, got that one
And
too, sir.
this is a picture of my wife and family when I came home from basic training, and I have all my shooting rifle medals and all that.
Okay.
And that's about it. Oh, and this is the Bronze Star Medal and the Combat Infantry Badge, which I'm proud of, and a Bronze Star Medal. And there's even one of my sharpshooters thing. Oh, and this is my ribbons. I had 3 combat stars and the medal that goes with the ETO.
Wonderful.
Oh, and here's my divisional insignia. I managed to throw it in there. Texas, Oklahoma.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. I didn't know I had that here.